All right, wonderful. I think we can get started. Chase, if you want to start the recording now.
Yep, we're all set.
All right, perfect. So I'm really eager today for our February presentation from the Digital Curation Interest Group. We're featuring Lisa Johnston, who's at the University of Minnesota, and she's going to be talking research data, which is a topic I know that a lot of us are very interested in. So she'll be talking today for about 45 minutes or so. Please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat box. I'm going to kind of be monitoring that and grabbing any questions to save till the end, and then I'll be helping share those back with Lisa so that we can hopefully have a really good discussion and she can respond to the questions that you have. So I will let Lisa take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Brianna. I am super excited to be presenting to everybody. And first, I just want to put out the little caveat that I am suffering from a cold, but that's the beauty of webinars, right? We don't have to all be in the same room together. So I will just apologize now for any future coughing that may occur during the presentation. So today I'm going to be going through and discussing a topic that I'm really excited about, and that is the curation of research data. For the last year and a half, I've been working on a book project that was just released by the ACRL in January. It ended up being a 2-volume set on data curation, and the first volume is a traditional edited volume of 12 chapters that were written by a variety of contributors on everything from how to build out your data curation service to analyzing the reuse patterns of researchers from different fields. So I'm very excited about that. And today I'll be focusing on the second volume, which is more of a handbook. This volume walks through all of the steps that a service would take for curating research data, really from the perspective of us as the practitioners providing data curation services to our users, to researchers. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, but I did want to include a link to both of those volumes, which has been released by ACRL as an open access ebook, and you can see that link below. So I wanted to just get started by introducing some of the concepts of research data and really kind of set the tone for our discussion today. And I wanted to make sure we were taking a very broad approach to what we incorporate as data. So I just have a list here of some of the different types of data that may be traditionally thought of as data, such as scientific data that might be aggregated data from multiple sources or raw data coming off of an instrument, but also maybe non-traditional aspects of data, such as a model or a simulation or a visualization, something that could also be maybe a digitized text, or perhaps some survey or observational data. So really thinking very broadly about data, not just from the scientific perspective, but from also the social sciences, the humanities, and other disciplines. Just give me my, there we go. And then next, just trying to also present us with a baseline view of data curation. And here I've listed out the definition that the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign's iSchool has as their data curation, which I feel like really encompasses a lot of the aspects that I find in my everyday work, where data curation is not only managing data throughout the life cycle of usefulness, but it also enables the discovery, the retrieval, it maintains the quality of the data, and in particular it adds value to the data and provides it for reuse over time. And you see a lot of these concepts maybe more succinctly illustrated in the FAIR principle. So to prepare and maintain research data in ways that make it fair or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which I think is also a very good description of what we're aiming for in our curation practices. So it's not enough just to talk about data curation. I want to show you what what it looks like before we really dive into the steps. So I'm coming from the perspective of an institutional data repository. As Brianna mentioned, I work with the University of Minnesota, and about 2 years ago we launched the data repository for the University of Minnesota, otherwise known as DRUM, which you see the homepage illustrated here. And all the data that is submitted to DRUM from our university affiliates does go through a curation process or curation workflow. All the data are reviewed as they are uploaded, and we apply all the curation techniques that are described in the book to each data set that comes through. So, for example, we recently received a data set that was submitted by one of our affiliates. And once we receive that submission, we will accept it, and then after a preliminary review, make sure that it meets all of our criteria, and then we get it live on the website. This submission in particular, I wanted to point out because this was the actual data that came to us. And if you're looking closely at your screen, you will see that there are maybe a few things missing in this particular submission. This data set came to us with no to little documentation. It was really just a set of numbers. Some of them were positive, some of them were negative, but really very little indication for us and then for, of course, the next user of the data of what these results are. And in general, as a repository, we want to make sure that the information that we're collecting and archiving and preserving for hopefully many years from now are useful and are valuable. So to do that, we worked with the author, we do with all of our data sets, to enrich the submission and to add value. So part of that process is, of course, adding metadata to the record. We'll do things like working with them to enrich that original submission and add key metadata that might allow others to potentially access and reuse the data. Another thing we did was work with the author to create headings, as you'll see here in that Excel file again, that really give better documentation for what each of those columns represent in the data file. And then finally, one of the more valuable aspects, I think, is adding a documentation file. And we use a documentation template that we've created to really help authors address some of the common questions that they're going to get from the next user of the data. And that's really sort of one of our major goals with curating the research data is addressing any of the potential problems that the next user is going to have and addressing them on ingest and working through that process with the author in a reviewer relationship. And I will say it's been a very positive experience in almost every case that we've come into contact with an author who submitted data to us, and working with them has really proven to be a valuable service that our library is providing. So with that kind of example in mind, I'll just take a few steps back and go over some of the reasons of why data curation is an important role for academic libraries today. One of the reasons is, of course, that digital data, the data that we most commonly are creating now, are more easily shared outside of their original context. So data sets that might have been perhaps created and submitted in the back of, like in this case, a thesis, a drawn graph here presenting some data results, or data that are printed as a table, as a part of a report, and even the data that are more contemporary and are presented is in our research articles as graphs, are not the actual data. They are representations of the data. They are graphical images of the data, but you cannot use or interact with those data points. So the trend is that getting access to the raw underlying data of these research outputs are really much more easily going to allow other people to understand and use those data. And data repositories have been doing this for a long time. And here's just a few examples of the various disciplinary data repositories that have supported more rich data sharing with the real underlying data supporting those publications. And using a lot of the different best practices that these repositories have had definitely went into the creation of the workflow that I'm going to describe in the next few slides. We are also talking about curating research data because federal funders require data sharing, and they're requiring it in such a way that really asking the researchers to address how data might be accessible for search, retrieval, and analysis. So again, getting to that point that the digital research data created by the federal funding agencies should be made available for reuse. And that to happen, simply publishing the data or the results in a journal article is not going to meet those search, retrieval, and analysis requirements. Journals also are definitely requiring researchers more and more to share the data behind those articles. And I really like what PLOS has done here, where the methods of how data sharing are maybe acceptable to them in requiring that researchers think about ways to deposit their data into an appropriate data repository is listed as the strongly recommended. So again, that need for making it available through a source like a repository that is going to apply appropriate curation techniques to the data. And then data sharing also enables a range of other principles that we are hearing more and more about in a variety of different disciplines around supporting open science and open data and the reproducibility movements. And this is really derived from a number of different factors, one of them being the idea that we need to instill trust in the results of the research that we're producing. And this idea of digital images that had been manipulated in some way kind of arose in the 90s with the use of Photoshop and other pieces of software that allowed users to really go in and make any edits or changes to the data, and whether or not that was ethical is still being really hashed out in terms of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable about cleaning the data, and in many different disciplines it's going to be different. Another area that is coming out of this in terms of trying to enable transparency is the need to review the retractions that are coming out of the journals. Some data that are not available after the journal has been published would maybe be cause for retraction if you cannot verify what that actual underlying data was and looked like for the results. And this also feeds into that idea that data cannot just be presented as a PDF, that there needs to be that underlying data in a machine actionable file format so that others can rerun the results and potentially reproduce your research. And you'll see projects coming out of the Open Science Framework, for example, where they're really enabling other studies to be reproduced and see this entire data sharing cycle come full circle. So in my opinion, data curation really supports all of these different trends, and it really underlies a lot of what the academic libraries also intends to do in terms of preserving and maintaining research into the future. So where does data curation fit within the research data lifecycle? Well, as many of you probably already know, the research data lifecycle encompasses a wider range of activities from the creation of the data from the researcher's perspective through all of the different data management practices and principles all the way through the actual data sharing or release or publication of the data. And this model that I have here is from the Digital Curation Center, and listed are the sequential actions. That's the dark red of the circle there of the data lifecycle model. And the steps in the handbook that I'm going to walk through very closely mirror these steps, really building on this really important work and giving us a framework for how to conceptually think about working through the different steps of curating data, but maybe taking a little bit more of a practical approach. So let's walk through those steps now. So these are the steps from the Curating Research Data, the Handbook of Current Practice. They range from step 0, establishing your service, through step 8, reuse. And I realized in this project that we couldn't just have a step 1 through 8 from receiving the data to reuse, because there really is that essential pre-step or preliminary step of establishing your services in a way that could be sustained and supported through appropriate staffing and business models. So really ensuring that your organization is ready to take on the role and responsibilities of curation. So step number 1 then works into the practical, which is receiving the data, really allowing creators of the data to submit to your service, which could be a curation service as like mine, which is an institutional data repository. So we're curating data that's coming into our stewardship. Or it could also mean you are working with a researcher who intends to deposit their research data perhaps to a disciplinary data repository. So really, I intend all of these steps to apply for really a variety of different ways that your data curation service could function. Step 2, appraising and selecting the data, really ensuring that the data meet your policies and mitigate any known risks that are inherent to digital data, and we'll walk through some of those in a minute. Step 3 is processing and treatment actions. These are really sort of the deep dive into the data. You're opening up the files. You're identifying any quality assurance issues that might be inherent to the data or the documentation. Step 4 is where we're actually ingesting and perhaps storing the data locally, or perhaps we're submitting it to an appropriate disciplinary repository. Step 5 is where we're applying our descriptive metadata, which may or may not be a discipline-specific metadata standard. Step 6, providing access, where we can ensure that the data are discoverable or that findable in the FAIR principles. Step 7, applying any preservation techniques over time, really thinking about ways that we might ensure that the data are usable in a format that are concurrent with the standards of the time. And then step 8, monitoring the reuse or impact of the data, and then perhaps even considering whether or not we want to dispose of the data or cease curation. So those are the steps that we're going to walk through in a little bit of detail today. And I'll just start off right off the bat from step 0. So this step is really encompassing a lot of the aspects that you would need to think through before launching a service. So thinking about your mission and your scope of your data curation service, which of course would include policy and any workflows or procedures that you would include. It's very important to think about who your target audience is, who is intended for your curation service, what are the costs involved, and that ties back into your staffing model. And then building and acquiring the technological infrastructure. So as a few examples of that, I'll share the the data repository at the University of Minnesota. One of the steps we took in this process was creating a business and service model for our repository and curation services. And this really took a look at all of the different variables that we would need to consider before launching a service. And those variables then lend itself to our actual published policies, which include a data collection policy, what we will keep and what we will take in, as well as an end user access policy, what we anticipate others to do with the data. And that is available on that persistent URL there. The other thing that we did was take a look at the staff that would be needed to run our curation program. We did this by actually doing a pilot where we invited proposals from researchers across our institution to work with us to curate their data. So we actually curated 5 different data sets from 5 different disciplines. And what we really found was that there was a level of expertise needed to working with, in particular, the file types, the software that were being used for creating these data sets. And so our data curation team reflects the various different software and discipline expertise that is needed by drawing on different staff within our libraries that either had that expertise or including data curation as a part of the library staff that we're hiring going forward. So for example, our public health sciences liaison, who is also our data curator for the public health area. So really kind of thinking about data curation as an additional role in some of our key library staff. The next thing we did was build out our infrastructure. Our data repository uses DSpace as the underlying software, and DSpace was chosen because our institutional repository is built around DSpace, and so our data repository is actually inside of our institutional repository, and that has had many benefits for us. where we're able to ingest data sets using a custom workflow and a custom submission form for the data repository, but then be able to link data sets to other reports or other collections that might be relevant to the data set. And that's worked particularly well for theses and dissertations, where we're seeing graduate students come to us with their thesis who also want to deposit a copy of their data. But there's lots of other different data repository platforms out there. I'll just run down the list of some examples as I did in the book. What you see here, this Dataverse is a really excellent platform for research data, in my opinion. And the Center for Astrophysics from Harvard is one really good example to take a look at how they're making use of the specialized metadata schemas that Dataverse enables. Digital Commons by vPress is another example. Washington University of St. Louis is a great example to take a look at their implementation of Digital Commons for data. Dryad, of course, is another really amazing data repository that has an amazing curation process that's described in a number of different case studies in the book, and they are using DSpace as their underlying platform as well. ePrints has been used by the University of Bath for their research data archive. You'll see Fedora as the underlying, one of the underlying technologies for Rutgers and their university research RU core, their research data portal. And then HubZero is the open source software used by Purdue for their Purdue University Research Repository, or PUR. Hydra is in place at Penn State in their ScholarSphere, which is an institution repository and data repository combined. Invenio is the platform used by Zenodo, and it's custom built for research data in this case, and it's also a really interesting implementation of this open source software. And Islandora is the platform used by the Simon Fraser University. So I hope that gives you just a few examples of some of the different platforms out there, and I'm sure there are others that I did not list here, but I just wanted to give you some jumping off points for ideas. Step 1. All right, we're moving into the steps now. So now in this next step, we'll want to think about a number of different things to really receive the data. And of course, you can't receive data unless you start recruiting for your service. There's a really excellent chapter in Volume 1 of the Curating Research Data book that does some research on the different recruitment tactics used by various universities on how they've been trying to promote their data repository. Another thing here in this step is to work through the deposit, so negotiating the terms of deposit with your researchers. That could include obtaining a written deposit agreement, for example, and then the actual facilitating of the transfer of the data, how this would actually take place. Will that include obtaining just the files, or are you also gathering metadata and documentation in that process, perhaps through a submission form? And then finally, that just notification that new data has arrived and the curation process is ready to start. So some examples from this step, I just wanted to post here a couple really cool postcards that I saw when I recently visited the University of Michigan in order to promote their Deep Blue data, their new data repository. They worked with a comic book artist and got some really amazing illustrations to highlight that there is a better way to preserve your data, which I think is really catchy and amazing. In terms of deposit agreements, I was really impressed by the restricted data use agreement that you can find from the ICPSR, one of the different repositories used there. It's extremely comprehensive and really covers a lot of the things that you would need to include in a deposit agreement that may contain confidential information. And some really nice language is to be found there. At DRUM, at the Data Repository University of Minnesota, we gather and collect new data submissions using a web-based submission form. In this form, we ask for a number of different data metadata fields. However, only 3 of them are required. And in fact, we've done some interesting usability testing and some analysis of the metadata that's being captured. And I've been very, very impressed with the amount of metadata people are adding to their submission. And I can only attribute that to the fact that they are submitting or they are publishing data for the first time through our service. So they are being comprehensive in their metadata in the submission because this is a first-time publication in that sense. So these are just the different screens that you'll see when you you submit data. And we do allow them to select and choose a Creative Commons license as part of that upload. Then I'll move on to the next step, which is step number 2. And in this step, we've received notification that a new data set has been entered into our curation service. And now what we'll do is consider, is this appropriate for us? We want to definitely appraise the files, consider any known risks, such as risks of personal identifiable information, or other risks that might be inherent to human subjects data. We'll do an inventory of the submission. We'll assess what we have, what are the files, what are the file types, what are the sizes, and then make a decision. Are we selecting this for ingest into our curation and potentially our repository, or are we maybe suggesting that they submit to a different curation service or a different repository? Some examples in this step that you can find in the handbook is one is an appraisal tool that was developed by the USGS, United States Geological Survey. They have an amazingly comprehensive appraisal form that you can download and take a look at all the different questions, but it really addresses whether or not this data set meets their collection scope, whether it meets their policies for what they will ingest and work with, and it's just a really nice way to think about that appraisal process in a much more of a checklist style that I can really appreciate. Another key thing, for example, that we think about with DRUM is whether or not the data contain any restricted information. One of our policies state that the data deposited must not contain any private, confidential, or other legally protected information. And the researchers who are uploading do certify to this. However, we want to make sure that that is being followed. And this is the procedure that we use, that we have published on our website, of how we evaluate new data sets coming into DRUM. So we actually run a variety of different checks. For example, we use a software tool called Identity Finder that can look for all of the different types of information that you see listed here. Now, there's a caveat, of course, that it's not perfect. It's not going to identify things that might be poorly formatted, or maybe it may not identify things that would be identifiable information, but isn't in the form of maybe a number or something that's easily identifiable. So we do spot checks as well. And when we find that a data set has anything to do with human subjects, we do go back and ask for a copy of the IRB agreement. So we want to see a copy of that approved form that all the participants signed to understand how the participant understood their data would be shared, and really working with the authors to ensure that they're carrying out their IRB agreement to the fullest. So Identity Finder is one thing that we use. The other tool that we use is Bulk Extractor, and this is used more for inventorying the submission, and sometimes we'll get submissions that include hundreds and possibly thousands of files, and so this tool is really nice to be able to go through and count out all those files and formats and help us appraise this submission. All right, step number 3, this is where we are processing and applying any treatment actions to the data. And as I said in my intro, this is kind of the more nitty-gritty. We're opening up the files, we're inspecting them, we are looking for any quality assurance issues, and really ensuring that there's enough documentation that would enable somebody else to reuse the data. And that really involves working with the author. So we'll address any of the questions that we have with the data. So, for example, I don't understand what your headers are. Could we please, work on that? And then working with that author, we'll try to enhance the submission by either adding new files or replacing them with updated files. So some of the examples of that, our curators with DRUM have a pretty comprehensive workflow that they use that really walks them through the process. And this workflow is very much mirrored in the handbook. But for example, all of our curators will create a curation log that will document any of the files that were submitted, and then any changes that were made to those files, and then also include any correspondence with the authors about those changes. So we have a nice comprehensive record of the curatorial process. This is a link to our Readme template that we use for a very large number of our, our data sets that come into the data repository. And again, it just really kind of pings the author and asks them a number of different questions and allows them to include additional information that they probably feel is included maybe in the publication that's related to the data set, but we'd really like to have it combined into the submission so that the data could be published and stand alone and be a comprehensive package that somebody else could find and reuse. So it includes prompts to get more information about the methodological information for how the data was collected, any quality assurance controls that were put into place during the collection process, what were the processing and analysis steps, and then very specifically, what are the abbreviations that are being used or the codes that are being used in the data set. So thinking about those headers, what do those headers mean in that Excel file, for example. Another thing that we do in the curation process, in particular for a wide range of file formats, is have a kind of a sub-workflow depending on the file format itself. So, for example, this is one of the case studies in the handbook that describes how to work through the curation process for 3D data sets. So 3D images, like the one you see here on the right, are becoming much more common, frequent file formats, particularly from archaeological data. And so what is the process? What is the workflow for doing this specific file format? And we have that a number of different subroutines, if you will, for different file formats that come to us, like genomics data or databases. And it's a work in progress. We're continually adding to our knowledge of these different file formats and continually adding new findings about how to treat them and how to best present them and how to preserve them. Another example is what Yale is doing. Actually, Lamore Pierre wrote a really great case study that describes her work on actually running the code that is submitted to the repository and enabling that code is usable and reproducible. So in this case, you might find potential errors or issues with the code and really treating it as something that the curators in the repository could do to really add value to the submission and ensure that everything is working correctly. Right. And let's see. Oh, I'm not seeing this. According to this, that's the end of my presentation, which is not true. Oh, it seems like we have Chase. I wonder if you could check in with me. There's my slides have run out. I should have maybe more.
Yeah, I have. Hold on. I have them all. Is this your next one?
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing anything.
You don't. Hold on one second.
I don't know,
Okay,
Brianna, maybe we could take a question in the meantime. Yeah, but there should be like 40 more slides after this one.
Sure, yeah, I see them all.
I'm embarrassed to admit.
No, I see them all here. Do you see these changing?
No.
One moment.
Yeah, we can absolutely take a question now, Lisa, if you're okay with that while Chase is working on.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, wonderful. I think the first that came in was from Kendra, who had asked, will you reject a submission if there's a better fit elsewhere, if there's a discipline-specific repository for a particular data set? And if so, do you provide support to assist the researcher in submitting the data set to the external repository?
Right. That's something that we've definitely debated. And I can say that we don't reject it. We would be willing to host a copy of that data set in our repository regardless. However, we definitely recommend that the author consider alternative repositories. And in some cases, they have chosen to go a different direction. In particular, ICPSR has been one of the places where people, once they discover what it is and what it does, they're very excited and really choose to deposit elsewhere. But no, we don't reject them because we have because we think there may be a data repository out there for them. And in fact, it's interesting with genomics data, there are a number of really excellent national genomics data repositories out there, but we're finding people are coming to us because they have additional annotations to the genomics data set that aren't accepted from some of those repositories. So they're using us as a repository that does accept the annotated genomics data file. So that's also kind of an interesting twist, at least for me, when we're exploring what the appropriateness is of disciplinary versus institutional data repositories.
Okay. Another question was from Doreen. So she said, you discussed human subjects and how you treat that data. What about endangered/threatened species and habitats and works that fall under import, export?
Hey, Doreen. Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. And in that case, we are not necessarily able to identify that type of information that, as you say, is also very protected and needs to be protected. We often are working with our authors to try to help make the best decision for their data. And I think if there was an issue where a researcher found that they could not provide the data without feeling that there was some risk, we would probably encourage them not to submit to a repository because we are an open access repository. We do allow people to embargo their data sets, but only for up to 2 years. So in that case, we probably would really urge them not to deposit if there was something that would really be damaging for that data set.
Lisa, it looked like Chase uploaded new slides. Can you check those really quick?
Yeah, I'm only seeing that one slide, actually.
Really? I can see all 42 of them.
Even on the drop-down where it just says one and both of the arrows aren't working.
Hold on, I'm going to pass the ball to Brittany really quick, or Brianna, excuse me, and see if she can see the other ones. Brianna, are you able to see the other slides?
I cannot, no.
Okay. Sorry, give me one more second. Thank you.
Thanks, Chase, for your work on this. We do have more questions, so that works out well. Lisa asks, could you talk more about how you projected costs and what business model you developed?
Yeah, definitely. All of our costs in our business model are available through that report. What we did was we took the results of our pilot, so the data curation pilot where we did really try to track time involved with each of the curation activities, who needed to be involved, and all of that work really fed into our business model. So having that pilot enabled us to estimate that it takes 1 to 2 hours per data set, and these are the people that we would need to be on hand in case the different types of data sets came to us. So that really, really helped, I would say, and led to the launch of our data repository with all of the curation services in place.
Mark asks, what is the largest size of digital asset that you're willing to take?
Right. So through our ingest form, we allow users to upload up to 2 gigabytes per file. And that's more of a browser-based limitation than anything else. For larger data sets, we do have a workaround where we can ingest data, but it's much more of the, what's the word, sneaker network, where we are walking hard drives across campus to ingest them on the back end. And we've done that with a couple of different data sets, and I mean a couple, like 2 to 3 so far. We certainly understand that there are people with massive amounts of data that do need data curation services, but I think the question for us is, how to how to really support those numbers of files that may or may not have been really ready for sharing and with enough documentation that would enable reuse. And so having the limit does afford us the ability to work with researchers to kind of help self-select what data that they are using. And I see, yeah, Doreen mentioned Globus, and that's actually what we are using for our supercomputing center on campus. And we've definitely been working with them to think about ways that we can connect the Globus interface to our data repository. But I still would urge people to consider what is that ability going to do for the curation process. If we can ingest, thousands of files and terabytes within a few hours, that is possibly going to reduce some of the reusability, I would argue, for those files. So just something to think about and something we'll have to consider and monitor going forward.
Steve has a question. For 3D images, do you only use open software to read the images versus proprietary software?
We try to create a version of the file, regardless of what it is, in a format that can be opened by open source. So if the 3D image comes to us in a proprietary file format, like, and I can only imagine one, I can't think of it off the top of my head, we will create a second version in an open file format, and then keep both. So we don't throw out the proprietary file formats because we still know those are useful, and many researchers may prefer that. But we definitely try in the curation process, and not just 3D images, but for a variety of file formats, to do the conversion into something that is also openly accessible and not proprietary.
Jim asks, at the University of Minnesota, what rights do researchers grant when they make their deposit?
What rights do they grant? So in the deposit agreement, they are certifying that the data, don't contain any private information, and that the University of Minnesota has the right to make transformations for one, and then also make it accessible. And we do not get any copyrights from them. They're not transferring any copyrights. However, when they deposit to Drum, they are also agreeing that the data be released under our terms of use. And that terms of use suggests to end users that the data are available to be reused. So we try to make that very clear in our policies that when you deposit to Drum, you are thinking that this will be reused. This is not just for preservation purposes, that they are going to be, at least either now or in the future, openly accessible. And yeah, I think I just saw what Mark mentioned about the Oklahoma Board of Regents. That's the same thing with Minnesota, where the data are owned by, and according to policy, by the university or the Board of Regents in both of our cases, and not the researcher. But I think it's also a very helpful conversation to have with the researcher who may or may not be aware of that sort of actual fact, but in practice, that's not always going to be their preferred state.
These are all really great questions. We actually have a few more that we can take. Chase, I just wanted to check in to see how things are going on your end.
Oh, I see.
We are on the case, and hold on one second. Which slide were you on again?
I believe 59.
59, okay. 1 second.
It's just so embarrassing that I have so many slides. I apologize.
I think I found the issue. I think was one of the images in one of the slides there was an issue with it when I opened it on my computer again. So I think that might have been what caused the uploading issue. But I think we're all set now. I'm going to pass the ball to you, Lisa, and then see what you think.
Yay! It works. Isn't that the case? The OIS image just breaks everything, doesn't it?
Perfect. All right. I think we're all set again. So
yeah.
Back at it. Thanks.
All right. I'll dive back in. But thank you so much for the questions, and keep them coming. So yes, this excellent image of how data might be stored in your repository and ingested and stored and securely stored in your repository. So in this step, we're considering ways to actually retain the files. And then I also include in the handbook a number of ways to develop trust in your repository, because I think that's a really key element, at least for researchers that I'm in contact with, around whether or not your repository is going to be around for the near term and the long term, and how to do that. So this is one of the workflows as an example in the book for how data flows through the ingest and the storage. And in the case of Minnesota, we do curation post-ingest, meaning we ingest the files first and they go live in their uncurated state, and then we do the post-ingest curation, that working with the author before we finalize it, and actually before we apply a digital object identifier, in this case a DOI. So the reason we do that is just due to the way that our infrastructure is set up. There are two other case studies in the book that illustrate very different examples, which I think is very helpful to think about. So Dryad's workflow is curation really pre-ingest on the back end, mostly due to the fact that they're working very closely with journals, and they're aligned in a parallel way with the submission of the article to the journal and then the data going to Dryad. Another case study from the University of California, San Diego describes their pre-ingest curation process, where they're really working with the data and the researcher prior to the actual ingest into the repository. So that's kind of why this step is in where it is in terms of number 4. That ingest step could happen before or after you are actually working with the files, and it really just depends on how your technology is set up. In step 5, this is where we're thinking about descriptive metadata, and I'm going to speed up just a little bit here so we can get to the end. This is a case study with one data set that's in the data repository from Minnesota. All of the metadata does get full text indexed. That means that everything in the documents that is a text is searchable via Google. Google Scholar picks it up, and we also use DataCite as our digital object identifier minting source, actually through ECID, through CDL. So all the data sets get indexed in DataCite search. And we're also indexed by SHARE, which is the Project for the American Research Libraries. So you'll see a number of different ways that the data sets can be findable and accessible, and that's mostly through the metadata and the indexing. Another case study I'll point out in the book is from the University of New Mexico, where they've come up with a really interesting relationship with a disciplinary repository, the long-term ecological research. Am I making that R correct? I'm not sure. But their repository is working very closely with the University of Mexico for access and retrieval. So a really nice example there of a good relationship. And I also point out Dataverse in terms of their metadata mapping, the way that they can integrate a number of different domain-specific schemas, I think is really impressive. Step 6 is more about access and really thinking about different access conditions. I mentioned earlier, some of the restricted data that you might be ingesting to your repository, where you could use perhaps embargoes if it's a short-term issue, but maybe there needs to be something for the long term as well. Applying your terms of use and the appropriate licenses, and then also thinking about ways to contextualize the data and put the data in place with its relationship to other research articles or other data sets. So I mentioned our terms of use for Minnesota. This is what our researchers are agreeing to when they're depositing to Drum. And in particular, we made mention that end users should not make use of the data to identify or otherwise infringe on the privacy or rights of individuals. And this was language that we were impressed by from, I believe it was I'm not going to be able to remember. It was ICBSR or a data center in Yale. But just really thinking about the value of the data, which may have, inherent identifiability issues, which a lot of data has been shown to do, but intending that users not take advantage of any of those flaws. We also offer a disclaimer on our data that it really intends that any issues with the data should be addressed with the researchers. And as I mentioned, we only require 3 metadata elements in a submission form. Contact information and contact email is one of those elements. Creative Commons was mentioned earlier. This is just another option to allow people to apply a CC license to their work, although it could definitely be argued whether or not a Creative Commons license applies to data, which data are, maybe many of you will remind me, that are not necessarily copyrightable. However, since we require documentation to ensure that the data could be reusable, that documentation, I feel, is copyrightable. That README file or that report or description of the data, I think very much is copyrightable. So the Creative Commons license may not apply to the data file itself, but certainly the rest of the package could fall under it. Another example around step 6 for access was the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and their service to mint DOIs, not just for data sets that are housed in their repository, but as a service for data that are housed elsewhere. And they did an excellent job of describing some of the thought process that went into providing that service in the book. And then step 7, preserving the data for the long term. And this is where we get into those different file formats that may or may not be in an open access format. One really good example is Excel. All of the Excel files that come into our data repository are not in an open file format, but it's a common file format. So we do keep a copy of the Excel file, but then we use this tool that one of our graduate assistants developed called the Excel Archival Tool, which is free on GitHub, that converts the Excel workbooks, takes each of the spreadsheets, creates a CSV file for them, but also captures all the charts, all the figures, all the formulas, and any formatting like highlighting or bolding of the content. And it exports this really nice package that can then be zipped up and added to the record, which we do for all cases when an Excel file is deposited to us. It also produces a really nice report that allows you to kind of count up all the different charts and figures, because sometimes you'd be amazed about how many charts and figures are hidden in that file somewhere. So it's really great to be able to capture everything into a nice package that we can feel certain is much more open and preservable going forward. Finally, step 8, reuse. This is where we're monitoring the use of our data sets and hopefully providing impact measures back to our users and to our researchers. And then we're really including support as long as necessary for the data. So just an example of some of the statistics for DRUM. Since we've launched about 1.5 years ago, we've received 106 submissions, a very kind of steady stream of like 2 to 3 submissions per month. We also are finding that the scientific disciplines are more heavy users, but social science is also up there. The primary file types are coming to us as Excel files, GIS files, but also 3D images, I mentioned, R, and other software code packages. We find from our users that they are very happy and find that the submission process is very easy. They're able to submit files. They're able to work with our curators. Preparing documentation is maybe only somewhat easy for some people. And that the very important features for our data repository are obtaining their DOI, of course, and allowing others free access, but also long-term preservation. Maybe more very important and somewhat important are curation assistance and the full text discoverability. And not as important for some people, at least, is monitoring access to their files or fulfilling grant requirements, which is that last one, which I found really interesting. Researchers are hearing about DRUM from a colleague or a friend, and almost everybody is very yes to would they recommend it to others. Only one is not sure yet. And we're keeping track of the file download statistics, of course, trying to monitor the reuse of the files and making that impact available to anybody who can access it. So in the very few last minutes, I wanted to just briefly describe some of the efforts to take what many of these institutions described in the book are doing for curating research data, but then thinking about ways that we can scale it and provide cross-disciplinary approaches to data curation, because as you might have seen in the trend of this presentation, is that there are a lot of expertise required for curating data. You need software type expertise or disciplinary expertise, and not everybody can have all of the different variety of experts housed in their sole institution to cover all the range of file types that we at most, our academic institutions have to cover. So one approach is the Data Curation Network, and this is a project that I'm leading up with 6 other institutions, and they're listed here, where we are trying to figure out a way with our 6 as a pilot to determine how we can share data curation experts. So if a data set comes into one of our institutions, it might get curated by a different institution. And of course, this is why, because we're seeing this trend of a wide range of file formats and a wide range of disciplines. So how can we provide expertise hubs across our institutions? So this is our vision for the next 3 to 5 years. We're in a planning phase right now. We've been launched since last May, and we really want to make sure that we can grow beyond our initial 6 partner institutions to ensure that data curation techniques are shared, but then also that we are each benefiting from this shared staffing service. This is our planning phase to date. We've done a number of different activities that are all available on our website openly, and I'll share that link in a second. But then in the spring, we are planning to publish our written model for how we believe this can all work. And one of the ways that we've determined how this model can work is by really engaging with researchers. So here's a list of the different data curation activities that might be involved in this process. What we did was we took those activities and we asked researchers, what happens for your data? Do each of these activities happen for your data now? And if so, are you happy with the results? We had focus groups at each of the 6 universities involved in the network, and we talked to 91 researchers. And we found that all of the activities, if they were happening for the researchers' data, none of them were happening in a very satisfactory way. So you'll see that axis, are you satisfied, on the left is not, you're not seeing a lot of things bubble up to the top. So there's a lot of room for improvement, and I think university libraries have a really great opportunity here. And here's some of that data for the most important activities. These are the top 10 activities that researchers really find important, but it's not happening for a majority of researchers. You'll see that persistent identifiers, discovery services, technology monitoring, software registries, and file auditing, all of these things could be useful services for researchers that aren't getting access to these, even though they think it's important. Similarly, there are a number of things that are happening for researchers, but not in a satisfactory way. So areas like creating documentation, maintaining the chain of custody for data, providing secure storage, quality assurance, data visualization, and creation of metadata. These are important things that may be happening, but not very well. So curators like us at institutional repositories might be able to provide best practices and additional services in these areas that would really go a long way. So those are some of the results from the Data Curation Network that's going to really help us build out a model for how data might come into one institution and then be appraised, but then the curation, the actual opening of the files and the reviewing of the data could be moved off to somebody else in the Data Curation Network who has the expertise to review the files and to work with that type of data. And then, the data would still reside in the local repository, it would still be served there and accessible there. But that data curation itself might be more split out across the partners. So that's our goal, and I'm really excited to be working toward that with a number of different institutions. I would really welcome other input on this model as we present it and develop it further from all of you. So this is our link to our website, the Data Curation Network, and I see that I am very, very close to the end of time, and I apologize, Brianna, but that's all I've got. So if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the last minute or two.
I think there's just one, and Lisa,
okay.
You're perfectly on time. We took a lot of questions in between.
Good.
So Kelly had a question that went unanswered, but you did actually cover it in your question or in part of your presentation already. So there is one question from Barry. How does Drum interact with RAM systems, Pure, Converis or symplectic elements?
That's a great question. Currently, it does not. I just had a meeting with our Pure lead at the University of Minnesota about how we can import the drone data sets into Pure. It's an interesting problem to have because we have an API. We do push out all the metadata for the data sets. However, it's really just not going into some of the more traditional abstract and indexing services. I guess it's in the Web of Science, the Data Citation Index, but not in Scopus, which fuels Pure. So we're working it out, but it turns out it's probably going to have to be on our end, as is a lot of different other file formats that don't fit into those types of systems just yet, like data.
It looks like someone was looking for the Data Curation Network link, but I think Maria added it to the chat box.
Oh, thank you. Yep, that's it.
Are there any other questions, or did I miss any questions? Okay, it seems not. Chase, thank you very much for all of your help today. Lisa, obviously.
Thanks for bailing us out.
Yeah, and Lisa, thank you for a really informative presentation. I actually wanted to take a quick minute. I know we're losing people who have to head to other meetings, but I want to take a quick minute to talk about the DSIG presentations that we have coming up in March and April. We haven't actually put these out on the listserv yet, so I'm not going to give the time zone and things like that, but just wanted to let people kind of save the date. So on Friday, March 17th, we are going to have a presentation called Using ePad to Process and Provide Access to Email Archives. And we'll have presenters from Stanford University, Glenn Edwards, Peter Chan, and Josh Schneider. That's coming up next week, or next month, I should say. And then in April, we'll have a presentation by Andy Ogier from Virginia Tech. That'll be on April 11th. And that will be building a communications hub and digital repository for community cultural development. So those are really exciting presentations, and I just feel so excited about the spring presentations that we have. So keep an eye out on the DSIG listserv because we'll be posting more information about how you can register. And thank you for attending, everyone.
Thanks, Brianna.